Now, part two of our two-part look at the war in Ukraine as it hits the one-year mark next Friday of the day Russia began the invasion. Yesterday, we talked about the state of the humanitarian crisis sparked by the war, with an estimated 14 million people displaced from their homes, according to our guest from the International Rescue Committee, and the incredible hardships, including shortages of food, power, and medical care for those who remain in their homes, not to mention those being killed, all because Russia is targeting civilian targets so much. Today, for this part two, we'll discuss the military state of the war, including whether either side can actually win or break the relative stalemate they've been in for basically the whole year, whether anything can move the two sides to compromises for the sake of peace, is it getting time for some Ukrainians to give Russia something that it doesn't deserve, plus the politics and finances of United States and European military aid, how politically or economically sustainable are they, and how do they affect the military strategies on both sides. And with us for this is Fred Kaplan, who writes the military affairs column for Slate called War Stories. He knows Russian affairs from having been a Boston Globe Moscow correspondent, and he is the author of books, including his latest, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. Fred's been extremely productive recently, by the way, so if we have time, we might also touch on his take on how the Chinese spy balloon incident was, in a way, a big misunderstanding, though in a way not. His debate on U.S. policy with foreign affairs journalist Robert Wright on foreign policy, and maybe even his recent article on why jazz versions of songs by the Beatles are always bad, except for a new album by the piano player Brad Mehldau. So is either side winning this war?
No, not really. An outfit called the Institute for the Study of War published a very interesting graph the other day where measuring how much land each side has taken over time. And if you look at the map, a few months ago, Russia had a kind of a big spurt. And then a few weeks ago, Ukraine had a big spurt. But basically, it's flat. In other words, neither side has taken any territory, despite, the fighting is fierce. There was a battle recently where Russia lost an entire brigade. That's about 1,000 soldiers in 2 days. Russia has lost, the estimates have it, about a half of their tanks. Ukraine has lost about a third of its tanks. It's just, and Putin's strategy right now, he's preparing for an offensive, everybody says. But what this offensive has amounted to so far is just throwing ill-trained troops into battle as, just cannon fodder, just to keep the Ukrainians from regrouping for their offensive, from having to remain on the defensive. But it's a kind of fighting that really harkens back to the early years of World War I. Everybody is dug in. Occasionally somebody will mount this wild-eyed mad rush toward the front, only to get plowed down. It's a kind of warfare that really nobody ever thought we would ever see in the heart of Europe again.
You mentioned those 1,000 troops in a 2-day offensive and all those tanks both sides are losing. Do you have a rough human casualty count for either side for the year, like numbers of soldiers or civilians killed or wounded on either side? I've seen U.S. officials quoted saying 200,000 Russians dead or wounded and 100,000 Ukrainians so far. Do you have any numbers?
Well, those are the same numbers I've read. I mean, on the Russian side, between 150 and 200,000. Maybe on the Ukrainian side, 80,000 to 100. And we don't know how many of, it's wounded and dead. We don't know how many are wounded, how many dead. This is based on things like satellite photography of, things like abandoned armored vehicles, and then inferences of how many people were attached to those vehicles and their support units before, and they're no longer there. So you assume that they're gone. In other words, nobody's doing an on-the-ground survey of people in hospitals. Or it's these are all very rough estimates. And in some ways, this is the most, in terms of data gathered, it's the most real-time, transparent war maybe that we've ever seen. On the other hand, there's also still a lot of uncertainties about the precise numbers of what's happening.
And for a little historical context, just to reflect on how many people are being killed or wounded in such a short, concentrated period of time, the total U.S. death toll for the entire Vietnam War, which was like a decade, is around 58,000. That's the number of names that are etched in the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington. That took 10 years.
Yeah, well, and the number of total Russian deaths in Afghanistan, which was also about 10 years, was 15,000. 15,000.
Right. Though I guess when we talk about, if I bring up Vietnam, I should acknowledge that it's generally believed that millions of Vietnamese were killed.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah, exactly.
And I assume the Russian casualties are all soldiers. Any idea the percentage of the Ukrainian casualties who would be civilians?
I think the casualty numbers that they're talking about are just soldiers. I'm not sure about, obviously, civilians it's much fewer. Let's say a bomb hits a school. Now, I don't mean to sound callous about this, but, if a dozen people died, that would be an enormous number, a large number of people. If there's some fighting on the field, a dozen people isn't so many. So the vast majority of these deaths are military.
But when I said in the intro that it's become increasingly part of the Russian strategy to target civilian targets, to wear down the population if they can't win on the battlefield, is that accurate?
Yeah, it's completely accurate. I mean, this is really warfare at its crudest, not just for civilians, but also the military. When the Russians have mounted an offensive, again, it's just rushing troops into the fray. Let's say they had a breakthrough. They broke through a defensive line. The whole idea of these kinds of offensives, theoretically, is you break through a line and then you surround the troops, you envelop them, and then you make the hole in the defense even bigger. Russia's army and its militia allies have shown no ability to exploit, to capitalize on any breakthroughs that they have. It's just, and a lot of the troops they're using. Well, this group of private militias, they've been recruiting people from prisons, saying, "Here, come with us, come to the line, and then you'll be free when you're done." But they're just being thrown into battle. The assumption is that they're going to die. They're just being thrown out in there just to be killed, to absorb Ukrainian bullets and missiles, and they're using, both sides are using about a million artillery shells a month. I mean, the carnage is just incredible. And yes, Russia has no plan for a kind of strategic victory, so they're just blasting electrical power plants, cities, and the whole idea is to try to wear out the patience of the Ukrainian population and of the Ukrainian army before a huge influx of new weapons and supplies will come in from the West, mainly from the United States. And the purpose, the whole point of Ukrainian strategy right now, which can't mount a tremendous offensive until it gets more of these weapons, is just to hold on, to keep the Russian army contained. And luckily, this Russian offensive is so incompetent, so crude, that as long as the Ukrainians can remain dug in and have enough weapons just to hold off their offensive, this isn't so difficult.
I want to ask you about the public opinion aspects of this on both sides of the conflict, but I also want to invite our listeners in, so let me do that first. Listeners, your comments and questions about the military state of the war in Ukraine or U.S. involvement in the war, which we will get to with Fred Kaplan from Slate. Fred, I know someone personally here in New York who is from Ukraine and is in regular touch with people back there. And this person said to me recently that the Ukrainian people are starting to sour on Zelensky and his insistence on continuing this war with the humanitarian disaster it's bringing, and that there's a growing sense that it would be better to live under Russian control than keep living with this, awful as everything about Putin and this war is. I have no idea if this person I know is in a tiny bubble or if there's really a souring on Zelensky and the war in any broad sense. I can find nothing suggesting that in the media that I've scoured, but I figured it at least is worth a question. So have you heard anything other than Ukrainians remain in a staunch no-surrender mode in public opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the public opinion polls go. You know, it's kind of funny. I was thinking when you said, you know, this friend of yours who's been in touch with the Ukrainian people. I mean, imagine if there was...
Well, with individuals they know.
Well, right. But, I mean, you know, it would be like somebody who's in touch with American friends back home. And, well, the question, are these Americans in Manhattan? Are they in Little Rock, Arkansas? You know, about any issue. Where are they? What kind of people are we talking about? The polls indicate that the massive majorities on both sides are in favor of the war. Now, are these polls reliable? I don't know. I think the Russian polls are probably not. I mean, if you're in Moscow and you know that it's against the law, you can be thrown in jail for a long time to even criticize the war or to criticize Putin. And somebody calls you on the phone and say, I'm with Public Opinion Institute. What do you think of the war? Are you going to say, no, I really don't like it at all? The guy has your phone number, probably your name. On the Ukrainian side, you know, there's a lot of punishment for collaborators. Let's say you really are tired of the war. Are you going to say that? You might even think if I say that, it's going to be bad for morale, which indeed it would be. So I don't know if we know much at all about what the... And then, you know, you have 1 million Ukrainians out of the country. You have more than 1 million Russians who have gone into exile because it's not the kind of country they want to live in anymore. So popular opinion is a fuzzy, ill-defined thing in this conflict. I do think, though, that... I mean, I've said this before, I think that if back in February of last year, if Putin had amassed all of these troops, 150,000 troops, and then if all he had done was just to occupy those eastern territories, you know, Donetsk and Luhansk, which he has always claimed were more Russian, and the polls at the time showed were more pro-Russia. And if that's all he had done, and done no more, and said, okay, this is part of Russia now, I think he probably would have gotten away with it, both in Ukraine and in the international community. I can't see the United States sending $20 billion in weapons to Ukraine. I'm not saying it would have been right. I just don't see it would have happened. But the fact that he mounted an invasion of all of Ukraine and that he has occupied these easternmost territories and hasn't made much progress since February in those areas, and has bombed and just murdered so many civilians, it has turned opinion even in the eastern parts of Ukraine against Russia. And I think if there was a peace talks tomorrow and Zelensky just said, okay, yeah, you can have those 2 districts, I think that would be seen by a lot of Ukrainians as a horrible betrayal.
Here's a question for you on Twitter, which I don't know if the listener knows relates to your most recent book. Fred's most recent book is called The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. And Fred, this listener tweets, given the lousy state of the Russian army, what should we think about the state of Russia's nuclear arsenal? Are their nukes in good shape and ready to work, or have they been poorly managed, and does that matter?
Well, that's a good question. Does it matter is also a very interesting question. If you think that your arsenal is effective and the main purpose of it is to deter the other side from doing anything that might set you off to launch them, it kind of doesn't matter. I suspect based on what I know, but this is dated. The Russians kept their nuclear arsenal in pretty good condition. They test their missiles fairly regularly. They seem to go off without blowing up on the launch pad, that kind of thing. I think it would be let's put it this way. I think it would be very dangerous to say, let's not worry about the Russian nukes because they probably don't work. I think that would be a very dangerous premise to go into any subsequent analysis with.
And with Fred Kaplan from Slate, as we have a little while to go here in part 2 of our 2-part look at the state of the war in Ukraine at 1 year. Yesterday it was on the humanitarian crisis sparked by the war. Today on the military state of the conflict. And Jerome, Jerome, hang in there. We're going to take you second. Acacia in Greenpoint.
Hi, I just wanted to hear his opinion, Fred Kaplan's opinion, on Seymour Hersh's recent piece and the impact that could have, both from a military standpoint and also collateral damage and the environmental impact that Mr. Hersh didn't even mention in his piece at all.
Bombing the Nord Stream pipeline.
This is a very long conversation, but I'll say very briefly, that story was based on one anonymous source. I've read subsequent analysis which indicates that some of the premises of that story, where certain U.S. ships and planes and certain Norwegian ships were at the time, turns out to be incorrect. It's been thoroughly denied. I assume that the reason why you haven't read follow-ups in any other newspaper or magazine is not because reporters and editors have said, oh, this is too dangerous to go into, but that they've looked into it and haven't found anything. Now, I would just say this. Could it be true that it was the U.S. that blew up the pipeline? Yeah, could be. But and I say this with regret, since Seymour Hersh is an old friend and one-time mentor of mine, and at one time was one of the great investigative reporters, but there's no solid evidence in this article to prove that.
Hi. So I'm calling about a recent op-ed page in the op-ed article in the New York Times. I don't remember the author's name, but I think it was titled something like, This is Biden's War with Russia. And the premise was that that we are sending increasingly more sophisticated weapons, more powerful weapons to the war, and these require all kinds of backup intelligence, on the part of the United States to make them effective, and that this is something like and it's going to require American sophisticated people trained to maintain these weapons, and they're not necessarily going to be Ukrainians. And he was pointing to kind of a mission creep that if things go the way they are going, it will lead to a direct conflict with Russia.
Fred, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say two things. One, it is true that the U.S. has been providing intelligence information to Ukraine from the very beginning, and this has been crucial. Ukraine has been able to mount ambush operations, for example, against Russian troops because our intelligence agencies have been informing their commanders where the Russian troops are, where they have been, where they're going, the kinds of communications that are going back and forth between Russian troops and their officers and so forth. This has been vital. This has been absolutely crucial to the Ukrainian war effort. It is also true that we're sending increasingly sophisticated weapons, which require maintenance and so forth, although Ukrainians are being trained to do this on bases either in Germany or Poland. I do not think that U.S. armed forces are actually on Ukrainian soil. As for the mission creep, I mean, one thing to say is that President Biden and really every other leader of the other NATO countries involved has been very careful to avoid crossing that line. I mean, Biden has said, that we've respected many of Putin's so-called red lines, even when they turn out not to be red lines. However, one red line that I don't think we're going to cross is that, not putting U.S. troops on the ground or in the sky over Ukraine, not allowing Ukraine to have weapons that could strike deep within Russian territory. And I think, Biden has said this many times. We do not want to start World War III. I think that the war, although its popularity here is declining a bit, it is still overall quite popular. And the reason for that is that no American soldiers have been killed. I think that the minute that an American soldier is killed in the war, I think, or a German soldier or a French soldier or whatever, I think that is when support really goes south. And I'm pretty sure that all the Western leaders realize this. And, they spend a fair amount of time reminding Zelensky of this while providing him with really, anybody who says that we're really being very skimpish in providing Ukraine with military support, really ought to take a look at the list of stuff that we've been sending them. It's really extraordinary.
And to what all that costs.
Hello, thank you. Ever since I can remember, there has been, it seems to me anyway, an unlimited budget for military expenses. And I was wondering if the U.S. Unlimited, yes. I was wondering if the U.S. government ever negotiates the price of weapons the way they do they negotiate the price of drugs.
And of course, they weren't allowed to do that until it just passed in the last Congress, negotiate the price of drugs for Medicare. But what about the negotiations with the defense contractors? Well, and are they making out like bandits with U.S. support for the Ukraine war?
Well, first, unlike pharmaceutical drugs, nobody else but governments are buying F-16 aircraft, for example. So that's all that it is. And there are negotiators. How diligent or disciplined they are is another question. Most of these weapons are coming out of U.S. stockpiles. And then the stockpiles are being replenished by paying the defense manufacturers to build more of them. Are they making out like bandits? No, a lot of this stuff is not really high-cost stuff. A lot of what we're doing is ammunition, artillery shells. This is not the stuff of billions of dollars of profits for Lockheed Martin. We have sextupled.
They were asking for F-16 fighter jets. Are we sending those?
No. And the reason, there are two reasons for that. One, or maybe three reasons. One, they are quite expensive. Two, it takes a lot of maintenance. Three, an airplane, Zelensky might say, don't worry, we're not going to fly. Our pilots are not going to fly over Moscow, but they could. They could with an airplane of that kind of range. And fourth, neither side is using many airplanes right now because they are getting shot down by a dense network of air defense weapons on both sides. Even Russia, which has air superiority over Ukraine, they're not sending their planes too far out in front of the front lines because once they do, they get shot down instantly.
We just have. So I hear all that. Many reasons for not sending them F-16 fighter jets. We have 2 minutes left. Two things briefly. One, while we're on the corporate profit side, did you see the Times article today, New York Times, about multinational companies already jockeying for position on contracts to rebuild Ukraine after the war. I wonder if that means the end of the war is in sight or just that companies are taking the long economic view of their interests.
Russian forces have begun an offensive in Ukraine.
Tens of thousands of new troops are forcing Ukrainian soldiers to pull back. This Russian attack comes near the one-year anniversary of the invasion. Ukraine's American allies expect to see more fighting in the weeks ahead. General Mark Milley spoke with our colleague Leila Fadel this week.
Now, as we get into the spring, as the thaw comes here, and probably a few more weeks, you're looking at the March-April timeframe, you are likely to see more movement, more offensive operations. So I do think this is a critical moment.
That interview is part of an upcoming NPR special on the war's first year. NPR's Tom Bowman, our Pentagon correspondent, is here to talk about the second year. Tom, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
What are the Russians really doing?
Well, it seems the Russians have started their counteroffensive, and what they want to do is gain even more ground in the eastern part of the country, in the Donbas, with the first-year anniversary coming next week. A lot more troops are heading in, and the sense is more towns in the east will fall to the Russian forces who, again, are trying to make gains. Russia is taking huge amounts of casualties, and they've lost a lot of tanks and armor. But again, tens of thousands of Russian troops flowing in. And Steve, there's a saying that quantity has a quality all its own, and that comes from a former Soviet leader named Joseph Stalin.
Tom, Ukrainian officials began 2023 talking about moving the other way, as did their American supporters, talking about a Ukrainian offensive or counteroffensive to take even more territory back from the Russians. What happened to that?
Well, we're likely to see it, and as General Milley said, probably sometime in the spring. Maybe April or even into May when the ground dries out. And also when they get their tanks and armor and better trained troops. Ukrainian troops are training in England in small units, and larger units are doing training at U.S. training facilities in Germany. They want to make sure they have, again, all the armor and the trained troops before they mount this counteroffensive.
I want to call attention to something General Milley said. He said this is a critical moment. But people are always saying that various moments in this war are critical moments. What about this particular set of offensives and counteroffensives would be critical?
Well, I think it's critical for the Ukrainians. They have to show NATO and the U.S. that they can actually achieve something. Can they push the Russians back in the eastern part of the country? Or can they, as some say, will likely head south and split that Russian land bridge that goes from Russia to Crimea? The sense is they may push into Melitopol on the Sea of Azov. That would prevent the Russians from supplying their forces in Crimea, because the only other way in by land is that bridge that you remember the Ukrainians partially destroyed a while back. Yeah. But what can the Ukrainians achieve? Now, they say they want to push all the Russians out of the entire country. General Milley and others have said, you're not going to be able to do that. And also, the Russians wanted to take the entire country. General Milley said they can't do that either. So what can they do?
U.S. officials have said again and again they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But let me interrogate that a little bit. Is there something of a time pressure here for the Ukrainians that they know that their support from the international community maybe can't go forever?
I think that's probably right. If they can't achieve much, you may start to see some European countries start to say, we can't keep this thing going forever. The United States may say, we're with you right to the end. But you might see some of those European countries, because of the cost of this, saying, you know what, it's really time to sit down at a negotiating table.